Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. So I just want to, I'm your host, Stephen Pynakker. I don't know why I always forget to say my name, but I have a very special guest here that I'm very excited about, a person whose writings I have been engaged with for decades. I've read many of his papers. I've read many of his books. I've watched just about all of his YouTube videos. I want to welcome onto the program Dan.
Oops. Well, it's great.
Dan Vogel, welcome to the program.
Good to be here, Steve.
So we're here, and I'm just so excited that you're on here, Dan. So welcome to the program. We had a really great 3-hour conversation on Saturday.
It was 3 hours?
It was about 3 hours, yeah. Time flies when you're having fun. So we had this about 3-hour conversation on Saturday. You were gracious enough to agree to come onto my program. You had said that, but first on December 17th, you were going to go on Mormon Stories, and then you'd come on my program. Well, the next day, after you did the 4-hour, 21-minute, and 53-second interview on Mormon Stories, the next day you and I were talking, and now a few days later, we're now taping this. So very excited to have this gentleman on. Now I've had Richard Bushman on. Now I've had Dan Vogel.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So welcome.
All right.
Well, I guess, one of the things we were talking about beforehand was I want to get a little biographical with you. So I want to let's just tell us a little bit about where you were born, some about your background, and then maybe about how you started engaging the history of the Book of Mormon and other things.
Well, I am a 6th-generation Mormon, and it goes all the way back with my great-great-grandfather Warren Foote, all the way back to the New York era of Mormonism, and they followed Joseph Smith to Ohio, and then to Missouri, and then to Nauvoo, and eventually they traveled across the plains with Brigham Young and established themselves in Utah. My grandmother, though, moved to Los Angeles to be a maid in a rich Mormon family's mansion, I guess it was. She was a maid with her sister, and then she met my non-Mormon grandfather who got converted, and then there's my father, and then there's me. So that's 6 generations, and my parents weren't really fanatical in the sense of attending church. They were what you might call hot and cold Mormons. Like sometimes they went and they were really gung-ho about the whole thing, and then other times they went inactive. So I got kind of a mixed bag of things. I wasn't too staunch of a Mormon growing up myself, but I got really interested in my early or mid-teens in high school, because during that time there was this Christian campus crusade. I think that's what it was called.
Yep.
And there was a lot of Christians running around my campus preaching and things, and they would say, "Oh, you're a Mormon? You're a member of a cult." And they would tell me all the ways I was wrong, and I didn't know anything about my own faith, really. And I go, well, let me research this, and I'll come back. And we were debating, the typical things like, is there a God, one God, or 3 gods, that kind of thing, or baptism is essential to salvation, or isn't it, and I would, introduce the Book of Mormon, and we would debate about the Book of Mormon. And finally, I started reading in order to answer these questions.
Just real quick, I just want to know, because this is where your world and my world interact with each other.
Yeah.
So you're right in the middle. Like, this is big time born again movement stuff.
Yeah.
You have, this is a really big time. This is about the time my parents were involved in the charismatic renewal movement. There was a lot of exciting things going on in my world, if you will. And there was very aggressively people doing the born again stuff. Even the editor of Skeptic magazine, Michael Shermer, right around this time became a born again Christian. What was it like? What was that world like, engaging them?
Well, they would walk around campus, and they would come to class carrying their Bibles, and have a big cross on their chest, you know, like a necklace, you know, with a cross hanging there. And it was quite, it was in the early 70s. And Vietnam was a subject also at the time. And there was not just Christians, there was also one of the kids was a Jehovah's Witness.
Sure.
And he would walk around carrying his version of the Bible. And so there was a lot of interaction about politics and religion and, you know, debating things. And that's when I really got interested in studying my own faith, you know, as a young Mormon. And of course, I was just born into it and defending what I was supposed to defend as a young Mormon kid. I wasn't going to church at the time, and I certainly wasn't going to seminary, you know, in classes before school. That came later in 10th grade. I started going back to church and studying, and my Mormon grandmother happened to live near us during this time, and I would go to her apartment, which she lived near my best friend's apartment, and we'd go there and visit her, and she would teach us about how to respond to challenges to our faith. And because she had been a missionary, a stake missionary, and she had all the books and tools and things that she would loan me. And excuse me, I had to get a drink. So I started studying, you know, proof text and memorizing scriptures. And actually, I had read the New Testament before I even read the Book of Mormon all the way through. So, pardon me.
We're just talking about how grandma was schooling you on how to,
so I'd come back and I would debate back and forth. And then my mother said, well, why don't you, it's time that you probably go to church, you know, since you're studying so much about the faith. And so I started going to church, and there was a lot of people there ready to embrace me. And it was like a family, a second family in a way. My family life wasn't all that great. And so I kind of gravitated towards it right away and started going to seminary. And then the next step was to go on a mission. So I went on a mission to England, Birmingham, England. And when I was there, I studied as much as I could. Before I went on my mission, though, I had eventually read the Book of Mormon, of course, and many times, and read a lot of Bruce R. McConkie and Joseph Fielding Smith materials.
Okay.
So I was kind of on the fundamentalist edge of, end of Mormonism, very conservative views of Mormonism. I had not very sophisticated version, really. On my mission, towards the end of my mission, I happened to hear about a Reverend Cuthbert, and he was a notorious anti-Mormon, and he would put out tape recordings of himself, arguing against various Mormon principles. And he would talk about the moon men, prophecy of Joseph Smith said the moon was inhabited, kind of stuff, and there was changes in the revelations and things like that. So I went to visit him because I was curious, and while I was there, he happened to mention that he had been to Salt Lake City, the capital of Mormonism, and he was real proud about that, and that he had gone and visited the Tanners. And he asked me if I knew about the Tanners, and I go, no, I've never heard of them. He goes, yeah, they put out lots of materials. Even BYU professors get their stuff because it's so rare, the photocopies of documents and things. And I hadn't heard anything like that as a missionary. And so I determined when I got home, I would look the Tanners up myself and see what they were all about. And all I can remember is that he said, yeah, they have a house, the Modern Microfilm Company, and there's a sign out front, and it's across the street from a baseball field. So the first summer I got home, I got my best friend, and we got in the car and we took off. And when we got to Salt Lake City, we didn't know where the baseball field was, and we were asking people, where's the baseball field, you know? And they go, oh, over here, go down that street, turn left, the baseball field. So we didn't know where exactly they lived, and so we drove around the baseball field until, oh, there's a sign, you know. And we went in, and I was looking around. It was Sandra Tanner was there. I didn't see Jerald. I saw Sandra Tanner was running the bookstore, and it was in that front room of their house. And I'm looking at their books, and I'm talking to Sandra, kind of annoying her with my true believer position on various topics. And finally, I bought a few books, and then all the way home.
So which ones did you buy? Just do you remember off?
Oh, yeah. I go, well, give me that Shadow of Reality. That's your main, what's your main text? I asked her, what's your main thing where I can just read and get most of what you talk about? Because they have so many books. And she said, oh, it's the Shadow of Reality. So I bought that. And then she said, oh, these 3 volumes of Case Against Mormonism is a longer version of what's in that book. So I took those, and it was, were talking about things I knew nothing about, you know, and these were my introductions to a lot of different subjects. So I made my friend drive it was my car. You drive home, I'm going to start reading. I would start reading and talking to him about, oh, look at that, you know, look at this, look at that, you know. And so when I got home, I was more trying to be an apologist for a while. And I was researching all the topics that they brought up. And I got onto some, you know, apologetic kinds of materials that defended Mormonism against some of the principles. Then I decided I would get a hold of some of their main sources that they were using, like Reverend Walters and Mike Marquardt. I first got in contact with Wesley Walters and started talking to him about the first vision. And it was about the time that he was debating Richard Bushman in dialogue on the first vision and the revivals. And also the 1826 trial. I was reading his materials. He had put out a couple of pamphlets on things and published some articles in other sources like the Journal of Pastoral Practice. So one thing led to the next, in other words, and I decided, it was still in my early 20s, that this was not, I didn't really believe as a regular believer. But I couldn't talk about it for the longest time out loud, you know, around my friends.
So when you're actually engaging, I mean, you're actually talking to the Reverend Walters and all this kind of stuff. So, but you're still a member in good standing. You're still a believer at this point, but you're maybe getting more sophisticated in your beliefs, or how would you describe your evolution?
I am shifting out of it, becoming inactive again. And
how old were you about this time when this?
But I wasn't during this same period. There were no other people outside the church that I could talk to that were former Mormons like there are today. Like there's a whole community of believers. And I just kind of went, what they would say, all the way of the world. And, you know, and I was not active, and I wasn't behaving like a Mormon anymore. I was going to the university and just being a non-Mormon in a way. But I happened to keep on going across the street to the Institute, and I did meet a Mormon girl that I married. But we because we weren't the most faithful Mormons anymore. I got excommunicated, but I didn't go to the trial or anything. They just did it to me, put it that way, and they disfellowshipped her. So
why would they have done that? What was their
it was
charge against you?
more not living
Okay.
the rules, the standards, and I was doing whatever I wanted to do
Got it.
as like a non-Mormon, because in my mind I was, but I was still hanging around because I had no other friends but Mormons, So at any rate, we ended up getting a divorce about a year into it. And I was 20-ish, 3, maybe 4, somewhere around there when we got divorced. And then I decided at that time I would just come out and start talking about it. I didn't have anything to lose, She was still somewhat of a believer, and I wasn't. So I started talking about it out loud, and so I lost all my Mormon friends right away. And so I had nobody. And that's why I wish I had some sort of community like there is a community right now, It would have been much easier probably working these things through.
Okay, so you get divorced, you lose all
Yeah.
your friends.
Yeah.
Were you suffering depression, or how was your mental state at
No,
this time?
I really don't. I'm not really troubled by those kinds of things like depression or anything. I'm pretty lucky that way.
Yeah, you're very fortunate. Yeah.
But you do struggle, and you have self-doubts and things like that. A lot later, if I jump ahead, when I was 31-ish, right around the time right after my father passed away, I did go to therapy, and the therapy helped me a lot. There's when you're in a all-encompassing community, and there's a lot of codependency in that community of not questioning, not wanting to be yourself. In other words, you're more of a community minded person, and you don't question anything out loud. You don't buck the system. You don't question the leaders. You follow along, or else people like frown on you. So there is a price to pay emotionally by being in a system like that. And then when you try to leave, there is a lot of emotional turmoil, readjusting to a new reality.
So I guess what I want to ask you is, so you're sitting in your car with all these materials you just got from this Tanner's, and you're saying, look at this and look at that. I want to know, what was, like, they call what broke your shelf? What was the one thing that you encountered that did it for you?
It would be probably the Book of Abraham.
Okay.
The Book of Abraham, the changes in the Revelations, the Book of Mormon being so much like the Mound Builder myth, those things that I've been writing on ever since. I as a Mormon, I was very interested in Mormon history. A lot of people wonder, well, you can leave the church, but you can't leave it alone, kind of thing. And the funny thing is that, well, I love studying Mormon history. It's my heritage. I am still a Mormon by heritage. I'm 6th generation Mormon. So I was very interested in studying Mormon history as a believer. Just because I stopped believing it doesn't mean I lost my interest in studying Mormon history. So, and I still have lots of questions about what exactly happened,
Yeah.
and I don't know what exactly happened. I'm trying to find out still, and I find it very interesting subject. And I was talking to my friend Britt Metcalf just the other night, and he made a very good argument. He goes, well, that's like saying to a classicist, well, you don't believe in Zeus, so why do you study the Romans so much? It's really a silly criticism.
Yeah, so I just want to pull out
Oh.
one of the books here that you co-edited with Brent Metcalf, American Apocrypha. This is actually, I think, in the Essays on the Book of Mormon series. I'd say this is my favorite one. I also like the Mormon Mavericks one, which I think is interesting because it tells, and the green screen's messing up here, I know, folks,
Oh,
but this is a,
you mean in that in that series of books?
in this
Yeah.
series of books. This
That's a
one
very good series.
it is, and so you brought up Brent, and I thought, oh, this is a good time to bring it. And you wrote 2 essays in this particular volume, and you edited it. I noticed that this was the first one that you edited as well, The Word of God, which I actually only bought this maybe a year or 2 ago. This is my most recent addition to this particular collection. So you are still engaged, and you're very interested in this. Is the things, folks. I find everything about the history of the Restoration, the Mormonism, especially the early years. So the areas that you're most interested in, I'm most interested in as well, to be truly fascinating.
Yes.
And this is a world that's familiar to me, and we can talk about that later. But I want to just talk a little bit about now. So now you're starting to, you're in university, and now you're studying things. So just talk about how, as a senior, you're actually asked to put together you put together like a paper or proposal about finding all these origin, because you had talked about the Mound Builder stuff.
Mhm.
That was kind of like your first foray into this. Maybe just talk about how you got into that
Oh,
area.
yeah. Well, I published my first book in 1986 as a senior in the university at the California State University at Long Beach. I was going there. And back then, we had no internet. There was no internet in which to communicate with people and maybe debate with people or disagree with people online about whatever subject. We used to write long letters, to friends and other people interested in the topic, And there, in my correspondence, I was corresponding with a friend that was still a believer, and they kept bringing up, well, Joseph Smith couldn't know this about Mesoamerica. They were defending the limited tail Wanapek theory as apologists. And Joseph Smith couldn't have known this and couldn't have known that. And I said to myself, well, let's find out what he could and could not know. So I wanted to collect a bibliography, an annotated bibliography of every book written about the Indians before 1830, and see what Joseph Smith could and could not know. Then we'll discuss it. So I started looking at books, and in those days, you had to go through microfilms. You couldn't just go to Google. You had to go to the library and spend endless amounts of hours, all day, hours and hours of going through microfilms and microfiche and microtext cards, and going through various collections and going through, books with the titles of books before 1830. And I would read the titles. And back then you're really lucky because they wrote these really long titles that told you everything in the book practically. So I would just turn the pages of these, volumes, 30 volumes, of titles of books, and year by year, and look at the titles, and I would write them down by hand because, I didn't have a laptop, so I write the titles down and the number that they appeared on the microfilm or microfiche. And then I would go and look page by page and read these books written before 1830 about the Indians and try to figure out, hey, what other views these people had about these Indians. There was a few scholars also that have written books on the Indian, the white man's Indian, and that's Berkhoffer's book, and some others that went through the same materials. And I would write down all the books that they read, or would cite in their books. And I would collect this bibliography, and I would write notes and keep notes and nice, important quotes. After a while, I'm going, wow, especially when I came onto the Mound Builder myth and how they thought the ancient Americans used steel and spoke Hebrew, and I started amassing this information, and I said, you know, I need to show this to somebody, like my friend Wes Wallers. And so I typed up all these quotes with just minimal connection, you know, to introduce them. And I don't know if it was 30 or 50 pages or something like that. So I photocopied it, sent it off to my friend Wes, and said, what do you think of this stuff? And he, unknown to me, he sent this to George Smith, the president of Signature Books. And George Smith called me up at my mother's house. I was at my mother's house at this time. I had moved back in with them to take care of my father, who was ill. So George called me up and said he wanted to publish it. And I was like, what? I had no plans about publishing. I didn't even think of it. And I said, well, let me rewrite this in the summer when I'm off of school, and then I'll resubmit it somewhat better. And I did that. And even after that, Susan Staker helped me at Signature Books. She was working with Signature Books at the time. She helped me rewrite it and put it into shape. And then we published it, little monograph of Indian origins and the Book of Mormon. You know, religious solutions from Columbus to Joseph Smith. And that was my first publication, you know, book. That was my first published book. And I think it has a lot of valuable stuff in it still. It's online for anybody who wants to see it.
Yeah, and I'm going to try to track me down a copy. Now, of course, you also did a YouTube video based on that as well. So if people want to check that out too, you could check that out, which I found to be very informative. You know, and just going back to the intersection, it was an evangelical or a Christian minister that was the one that kind of got you on track to doing what you're doing. And
Wes and I used to have long phone conversations, you know, and we disagreed about certain things like evolution and how old the earth is and things like that. But we had this interest in Mormon history. And what I loved about Wes was that he would actually get in his car and go and drive to these places and look for these documents. And he actually found some of them. And he would write about them, and he tried to be as objective and scholarly as possible, which I really enjoyed. So we could connect on that level, you know.
For a couple of questions, just because this is so interesting to me, what kind of person was he, and did he ever try to witness to you or try to share the gospel with you from his viewpoint?
As it turned out, I went and spent it was at least a week I spent with him, and he was such a generous, and he was a gentleman. He was a Presbyterian minister. And I went to his church and listened to him preach, and because it was right across the street from his house. His house was owned by the church. He had this huge old house. It's not there anymore, but it was 2 stories, old wooden house, and it had an attic in it. And in the attic, he had books that he had bought, a string of photocopy. This guy, David, I forget his name, but he used to be a publisher in early Mormon documents, sort of like the Tanners. And I can't remember his last name, but he had all of this stuff up there, and that let me just go rummage through it. And he had his own photocopy machine, and I just photocopied tons and tons of stuff. He had an office that had like 4 or 5 file cabinets full of stuff. And he was very generous and very courteous, and helped me along. He actually helped me and Mike Marquardt. He bought us our first microfilm reader. Wow. He got some money from George Smith to help him in his research, and he shared that with me and Mike Marquardt. He helped. I came home from work one day, and on my doorstep were these boxes, and it was my first computer, and Wes had bought him. He had got this deal from some manufacturer. It was an Apple, and at these times apples weren't so good back then either, but they were better than a typewriter. You know, and I was going, how am I going? I don't know anything about computers. And I was looking into buying a computer, and they were so expensive back then. But he gave me my first computer, and I wrote Indian Origins on a typewriter. Okay. And photocopied it, you know. And then this is my first Apple computer, and I was using that for several years, and then finally got the IBMs came around, and it was they were much more sophisticated, but you still had just a green screen. You know, now there are just so many worlds far further along than that.
So I'm just curious. One, I want to get back to if he tried to convert you. Now he's a Presbyterian, so maybe he didn't.
Did he try?
Yeah.
Not strongly.
Okay.
Not strongly. He wasn't overbearing or anything, because that would probably have ruined our relationship in a way, you know. But we would every now and then he wouldn't like testify to me or anything and come on to me real strongly about, you know, bearing his testimony or anything like that. But he would let it be known what he believed. Okay. So, and I'm a pretty tolerant person. I let people have their space, and they're on their own journeys, and I don't try to force my views onto other people either, because everybody's moving along, and I'm just an information guy basically. So I'm just to kind of wrap up Reverend Walters, because it's an interesting story, and I find this to be fascinating, is what got him interested in Mormonism in the first place? Oh, I'm not really sure about that. It's been so many years since we've talked. I don't know exactly what got him onto it, but he was pretty dedicated, because he was sort of like me in that he would spend his vacations traveling around looking for these documents while, you know, his wife was visiting their relatives, and he would get in a car and go off to another state to look for some documents. So just to be, I want to make sure I'm getting everything right about him. He's the one that came up with the idea that the revivals didn't correspond with the time of the first vision. But is he also the one that found the court records? Yes. He's 26. He's the one that found the court records in the basement of Chenango County Courthouse that were being ruined because water, it was in the basement, and water was destroying the documents. So he saved them. He saved the documents in the nick of time, really. Fascinating. And just a great story. I'm glad you shared some more about his story, because I just find him to be an interesting person. And when did he pass away? It has to be maybe 20 years, really. And he had a genetic problem with the tendons in your body not functioning correctly all over his body. But you know, you have tendons in your heart, and he died from that, from the heart, you know, the tendons on the valves in the heart. He died suddenly. He was in the hospital, and then he just died suddenly. And he had a son and a daughter, I think it was, that had a similar situation, and they had died at young ages. But Wes was, when I was with him, he jumped in the car with me and started driving all over the place. And he took me to, I think that's the mound where the Kinderhook plates were dug up. He took me there, and he took me to the Cahokia Mound outside of, across the Mississippi from St. Louis. We went up in the St. Louis Arch, and he was a great guy. Wow, that's great. Now, did you get to Zelf's Mound? Did you find that yourself too, or no? We didn't go to the Zelf Mound. Okay, it was only where he thought
He
the
thought.
Kinderhook plates had been dug. I remember that. Uh,
Well,
so
and then just so you
I missed him. I missed him for
Yes.
many years after he died. Shortly after he died, for many
well, you had
years.
the close relationship with him. I mean, he really helped get you started, man. And
And he would call me up all the time.
oh,
You know.
yeah. Wow, great story. So we're talking about, so you come out with your first book, and then you're asked then, you're then at a relatively young age, then editing this book, the Essays of Mormon, the Word of God. And so you're jumped into this world. You have this relationship with Signature Books basically now for how many decades now?
Yeah, probably 35 years, probably
Yeah.
35 to 40 years. It's been a really good relationship. The people that work there are really good, and I really have a lot of confidence in their abilities.
Yep. Yeah, they seem to, they put out a top-notch quality product, and I've read a ton of their materials, and I find them to be just a great asset. And it's just wonderful that you've had this relationship with them all these years. And it's interesting because you kind of took a different path than what a lot of academics took. You're not somebody who's been married to an institution. You've kind of done your own thing. Maybe just describe and explain why you took that course.
Well, I really wanted to study and write about Mormon history, and when I was going through the university to get my bachelor's degree, it was taking a lot of time away from what I wanted to do, and I just had this urge to get to the Mormon subject and learn as much as I could, as fast as I could. And I saw that the academic thing would probably soak up a lot of that time and distract me from what I really wanted to do. And I couldn't have done what I've done without George Smith and Signature Books. So it was kind of a mutual beneficiary kind of situation and relationship. They're all retiring now themselves, and from Signature Books, it's being taken over by really capable hands, also. So it's going to live on, as long as I can foresee anyway. Yeah. But I'm really fortunate to have been more or less sponsored by them and George Smith, the Smith Pettit Foundation, which was another company that George Smith founded that sponsors a lot of scholars. And they sponsored me and over the years to do various projects. And I've enjoyed it immensely. Yes. So that's sort of like why I didn't go into teaching. I did get a degree, and the kind of courses I took were to enable myself to teach high school, at least in social studies and not just history. So I had a little breadth into sociology and psychology and social studies and anthropology and things like that, not just US history. Anyway, so I try to learn as much as I can about all sorts of other subjects to bring it to bear on Mormonism as much as I can.
Yeah, it's very interesting, Dan, about just the history of, you took a different course in your life. You're not following institutional academic thing. Now, I will tell you, there are some critics that kind of look down on you, and kind of poo-poo your work a little bit because of that. Maybe just kind of respond to that.
Well, the critics, of course, you're talking about our apologists who try to use an argument of authority. Mm-hmm. And this argument of authority is really a logical fallacy. You're supposed to respond to my actual work, and the focus should not be on the author and to try to poison the well, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But I think my work speaks for itself. I have a pretty good reputation. I have 6 awards for my writings from Mormon-based historical societies, necessarily, American historical societies, but Mormon-based historical societies that know the subject quite well. So I take their awards as probably an indication that I shouldn't be brushed aside so easily.
Yep. So I guess now you've obviously very much established. You really did a lot of stuff with the Book of Mormon. You did the Joseph Smith biography. And of course, you've done some stuff with the Book of Abraham. So you've covered all these bases. Now, before we get into like individual topics, I just want to ask, when you decided to tackle a particular subject, what made you decide to tackle that particular one? What was your initial interest in tackling some of these subjects? And then we can kind of flesh it out with these various things.
Well, mostly like I mentioned before, the first book was triggered by a response to my friend saying Joe Smith couldn't know this or that. And I go, well, what could he know? And I'm curious myself.
Okay.
And I pick subjects that I'm personally interested in also. I've turned down subjects that I'm not interested in, so I want to know the answers just as much as maybe somebody else out there. I'm just learning as I'm going. And
Signature Books gives you a lot of freedom to do that. Yes,
sometimes they have proposed subjects to me that I haven't been interested in, but most of the time I'm interested. Especially if it deals with Joseph Smith and the origins of Mormonism. When I went through the university, I usually took the first part of every subject, like the history of, I was interested in the Jacksonian period of American history, but when I took the history of, I say Soviet Union or Russia, it was the first part that I was mostly, how did they get started, and how did it get started? How did things get started? That's usually what piques my interest, is how did this all get started? In whatever subject. So I have to want to know the answer, and sometimes I don't know how it's going to turn out myself. When I'm writing the biography of Joseph Smith, I don't know how I'm going to come down on whatever controversial issue there is. And a lot of times some people ask me what my views are, and I will frankly just tell them I don't know. I haven't researched that, but I might have a tendency for one view over another, because everybody has biases. I have biases. I'm a naturalist. I have naturalistic biases. So actually, I've spent the last 4 years doing Joseph Smith's middle years, from 1831 to 1839. And a lot of it I was learning, just like anyone else. It's not like I know everything, so I'll decide to write about it. You really can't know everything until you write about it, and that's why I like writing, is because writing is learning. You're working it out, and you're trying to see how, when you start getting a larger picture, you start being able to see things that you couldn't see until you had more information, and you have to gather that first.
So I guess I want to kind of enter into an area that I find very fascinating, and Christopher Thomas and I, Christopher Thomas, who wrote a blurb for your Book of Abraham book. You actually haven't met him yet, but hopefully we can facilitate something soon. But him and I have conversations about the early days of the church, so the starting point, right? And I tell people, I said, on April 6, 1830, if I go into that room where they're founding the church, supposedly, right? There's some controversy on the about where it was founded. Well, let's just say I'm in the standard narrative, and I'm in that room, and in that room, I'm with other evangelical, born again Christians. I said the other day, some are spirit filled. You said most are spirit filled Christians, and so I always like to give the analogy that when they talk about the early days of Christianity, they say, well, Christianity was a Jewish sect. It was all initially Jewish people in Christianity. And I always like to say, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on April 6th was, or the Church of Christ at the time, was full of evangelical born-again Christians. My people, I would feel very comfortable in that room. So maybe let's just talk a little bit about that.
Well, the problem with are Mormons Christians question, and in my mind, yes, they're Christians. It doesn't matter, even if you disagree with their doctrines. The doctrines don't determine whether you're a Christian or not. I mean, there was never a Christian church. There was a lot of Christians. There was a lot of different Christian churches. There wasn't one Christianity. And in the beginning of the Christian movement, they were just meeting at the synagogue until they got kicked out, until the Jews kicked them out because they were too different, So there wasn't like, oh, you don't believe the Orthodox Christianity, so you're not really a Christian. I mean, Paul would try to correct people on various beliefs, if there's no resurrection, the Corinthians don't believe in a resurrection. He doesn't go, you're not a real Christian. He tries to correct them and he debates with them. So even if you disagree with what the Mormons believe, it doesn't, in my view, it doesn't make them unchristian, or they're not real Christians. To me, they're real Christians, and they may have different beliefs than you, even if they're incorrect beliefs, but they're still Christians. So, and they view themselves as Christians. That's the important thing to me. They think they're Christians. And a lot of people try to get me to come down on Mormons of not being Christians, and I tell them, it's not my job to decide who the real Christians are.
That's right.
That's not my job.
Nor should it be the job of any person.
Right.
That's not their. If you believe in God, that's God's. God makes that call.
Yeah, I'm not going to decide who are the real Christians. That's not my job. I'm a historian.
That's right.
Okay. And to me, the most important thing is that they believe they're Christians. They talk about Christ. They believe Christ. So in my view, they're Christians, and there's really not all that much difference. There's no test of faith in my vocabulary here. That's not what I'm all about. I'm not trying to prove Mormons aren't Christians and that there's some kind of bad people and that kind of thing. So I don't know if I answered your question, but
well, I was just kind of talking about the context of the world, that group of people that initially founded the church would have been considered very much evangelical in their mindset. Yeah. And then, of course, you have not long after that, the Rigdon followers of Sidney Rigdon, who are with the Campbellite movement, which is another type of evangelical movement. So it's just, I guess what I'm trying to get across to the audience, and of course, many of you already know this, is the fact that this was a church that was founded by Christians. This was not something that was foreign to Christianity. And people say, well, the reason why people join cults or whatever is that they don't know the Bible. This is like some of my literalist family and friends would say this. I said, no, you don't understand. I said, the reason why Mormonism took off was because people were very familiar with the Bible. And the Book of Mormon actually helped provide many of the answers to the questions that the Bible did not address. And that's how it resonated. It was a highly literate population of Bible believers who knew the Bible very well, better than most modern day Christians do. And it was part of the culture. And so the Book of Mormon actually, in their mind, actually very well complemented the Bible. And so I think that it has to be understood that it was actually Bible-believing Christians, not all, of course, but they were all basically Bible-believing Christians that embraced the Book of Mormon, embraced the church at that time.
Yeah. Well, there was a struggle in the 19th century, and and at other times too, about what kind of restoration should you have? Should it be just a restoration of the form or the substance? Should you restore the Christian church just in form and belief and doctrine, and get rid of all the Catholic kind of innovations and make it more pure in its form? Or should it also include a spirit filled and include miracles and speaking in tongues, and have instead of it being the form of godliness or whatever, it would have the power thereof, to take a passage from the Bible. And a lot of what happens it's a natural it's a natural thing that happens when you become very charismatic. There is a danger in other charismatic groups causing it to splinter off. And that was Joseph Smith's fault or problem with the having charisma.
Yeah, and so the need, it's almost, and you see this pattern in all churches where you have like
Yeah.
revivals and stuff like that. At some point there feels this bureaucratic need or something to institutionalize it, so
Yeah.
that so that you can take control of it and not let it get out of hand in their minds.
Exactly. So a lot of people veer away from actual having charisma because it's kind of dangerous to keeping control of the situation.
And that's what Joseph did early on. And that's a fascinating story. I want to talk about Mark Staker. Of course, he talks about how Black Pete gives the history of that and a lot of the movement that was going on. And then they felt the need to tamper it down. Interestingly enough, Brigham Young comes around and starts speaking in tongues, and that seemed to be acceptable. So you have this, they're trying to work it out, like, okay, Black Pete took it too far. Maybe it's because he was Black and they didn't like that. But then Brigham Young brings in the tongues, and Joseph said, this is the pure Adamic language. So you had this interplay between trying to allow there to be the power there, but then to try to rein it in as best you can. So you have early on in the church, it appears that Joseph is grappling with this, and then he kind of not only institutionalized it, but he pretty much then puts himself in the position as being the essential sole authority when it comes to these things as the prophet. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, exactly.
So so just now that since we're actually in this period of time, you had mentioned about how you're working on the middle years, 1831 to 1839. And you've spent 4 years on this, and you've been commissioned by Signature Books to talk about this period. Just maybe give a little preview of some of the things that you've found, or just hint towards some of, I know you haven't published, so I don't want you to give away too much information, but maybe just give some general observations about this period, 1831 to 1839, that you've come across.
Well, things really changed for Joseph Smith when he moves to Ohio. I mean, in New York, he had followers and they were like scattered around. But in Ohio, they were concentrated in the Kirtland, Ohio area. And that gave him a lot of political power right away. And the non-Mormons right around were worried that the Mormons would take over, through voting as a bloc, and they'd have a lot of political and economic power. And that's one thing that got them into trouble both in Ohio and Missouri. So, and that's the period we're covering, 1831 to 1839, when Joseph Smith leaves Missouri. So for a time there was 2 headquarters, and that posed a lot of problems as well. But Missouri was the Zion, even though Joseph Smith was located most of these years in Ohio. And he made several trips to Missouri to organize the church there. One of the major themes that runs through this period, though, is the institutionalizing of Mormonism. Because it began as a charismatic movement, it was liable to splinter into fragments because other people had charisma also. They started getting revelations, and that challenged Joseph Smith's leadership. And so the story is mostly concerned during this period with Joseph Smith maneuvering, getting revelations, organizing in order to control charisma so that it didn't challenge the institution. So that's a major theme that runs through the book. That's what my book is titled, if you recall, Charisma Under Pressure. That's what I've called it. It could change titles with the publisher, you never know. But Charisma Under Pressure. And that kind of alludes to the writings and research of a sociologist named Max Weber, a German or Austrian sociologist, Max Weber. He wrote famously a treatise on From Charisma to Institution. And it doesn't apply only to religious groups. It applies to almost any institution that gets started, especially with a leader involved. So there are very predictable ways in which these institutions will develop in order to stay together. If they don't develop along certain lines, they usually splinter and fragment into smaller groups. So anyway, my book is mostly about the maneuvering and what the meaning of the revelations are and what Joseph Smith is doing to hang on to his sole authority in the church. In midway through the story, there's a little episode called Zion's Camp. And in 1833, the Missouri church lost its place in Jackson County, Missouri, and they got kicked out of Jackson County, Missouri. And so there was this huge concern about regaining the Holy Land of Zion. It was like the Jews losing their Jerusalem, you know. So everything was tied to this Zion, Joseph Smith's prophecies and authority. And so there was a lot of stress on Joseph Smith to try to obtain this land again. And one of his methods was to do it by force, more or less. He gathered up 205 different Mormons from around the area. Some they got armed, some with guns, some with other kinds of weapons, and they marched like 800 miles from Ohio to Missouri in order to forcibly move the Mormons back onto their land and to protect them while they were there. It's quite more complex than that. With the officials didn't quite like an army coming into their state, you know, so there's a lot of negotiating, but the main principle was to have the governor and the militia, state militia, help restore the Mormons to their lands. And then the governor said that he could not legally have a standing army in the state. So Zion's Camp was supposed to provide that standing army to maintain the Mormon hold on Jackson County, Missouri, on the lands that they owned. But they found that the opposition was a little larger than Joseph Smith estimated or counted on, and they could not do it by force. And it would have been a bloodshed. And Joseph Smith disbanded Zion's Camp, and that became a huge controversy in the church. And a lot of Mormons began questioning Joseph Smith's inspiration. So that when Joseph Smith and Zion's Camp returned to Ohio, there was a lot of apostasy. There was questioning of whether they were being led by revelation or not. And so Joseph Smith began to receive revelations, began to maybe distract the situation by organizing the church. So this would be the failure of charisma, and where that Max Weber talks about. And what happens when prophecy fails is another study by other sociological minded historians. What happens when prophecy fails? So either you explain the prophecy, you distract from the prophecy and say why there's a delay, that you couldn't delay, or the members weren't faithful enough to get the land of Zion back. So anyway, my book is about all the different things Joseph Smith does to recover from this crisis. And one of them is organizing the church and then predicting a delay in the millennium, and sharing of authority. So he organizes the hierarchy in more earnest effort to organize the hierarchy. This was 1834 when Zion's Camp, it was May 1834 when Zion's Camp went to Missouri, and June by the time they came back. And Joseph Smith started organizing the hierarchy. First, he and Oliver Cowdery worked together on a history of the church that revealed something that most Mormons didn't know. And that was that Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery in May 1829 had been ordained by an angel to the Aaronic or lesser priesthood, and that shortly after they were ordained to the Melchizedek or higher priesthood. And this also was a time when so they in having been ordained by angels, they were claiming an authority, a chain of authority. And once you have a hands-on ordination instead of a charismatic concept of authority, you now have a chain that can't be broken. And if usurpers try to break off, they break the chain, and they have to explain why they're breaking the chain, or claim some sort of other kind of authority that is more difficult to break off of than just claiming some revelation or Pentecostal type authority. So as you can see, it's quite complex. It gets quite complex really fast here. And he also starts sharing authority, and he organizes the 12 apostles and first presidency in order to share this authority. So it's quite complex to try to lay it down right here. I would suggest getting the book when it comes out, because there's a lot to grasp there. But
during this period of time also, this is the period of time where Sidney Rigdon comes into the picture in this time frame. And so maybe just talk a little bit about what Sidney's role played, especially in those early years of the church and during this time.
Well, Sidney Rigdon was converted in 1830 and went to New York to meet Joseph Smith. And he met Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith was taken by Rigdon right away, because Rigdon had broken off from the Campbellite organization, and the Campbellites believed in a restoration also, but not with charismatic authority or any kind of gifts of tongues or healing, things like that. But Rigdon wanted a restoration of spiritual gifts, a restoration of the actual church that existed in early Christianity. And Joseph Smith seemed to provide that kind of restoration that Rigdon was anticipating and looking forward for. So he was converted to Joseph Smith's gospel, and Joseph Smith was already planning to move to Ohio because of the large amount of converts that had been there. Nearly all of Rigdon's congregation were converted, and other former Campbellites around the area were converted in mass, almost hundreds. And so that shifted the power of authority to Ohio, and Joseph Smith had no choice really but to move there and be with his converts and to nurture his church and organize it and keep it from splintering, because they were very, very charismatic in northern Ohio. They were a little too charismatic for Joseph Smith's taste, and he went there and he reined that in right away. That was his major concern, and he more or less labeled some of the extreme charismatic behavior in northern Ohio as Satan inspired. So anyway, Rigdon became, because of Cowdery's absence in Missouri, Rigdon became Joseph Smith's right-hand man and spokesman. And Rigdon was a great orator in the Campbellite movement before he became a Mormon. So I don't know what else you want to know about Rigdon.
Oh yeah, it's a fascinating thing. And then just to kind of tie in one last aspect of charismatic aspects in this period of time is that they are visited. I don't know if you touch on this in your book, but maybe we could just briefly touch on the Irvingites from Europe. Coming and talking with them.
Yeah, there was an exchange with the Irvinites, but the important thing about that is that Rigdon was a charismatic Campbellite, let's say, and he wanted more than just a restoration of the form. He wanted the restoration of the power thereof.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that there's a lot of groups around Europe and America that were anticipating this kind of charismatic restoration. And I wrote a book on it. It was my second book in 1988 called The Religious Seekers in the Advent of Mormonism. And seekers were those who were seeking this more charismatic restoration, or a restoration of new apostles being sent. They weren't sure how the restoration would occur, that either new apostles would be sent or there would be a Pentecostal-like endowment of authority rather than apostles being sent with authority. And there were in England the Brethren, and when the Mormon missionaries went there, they converted them en masse because they were anticipating some sort of restoration to occur. And the Mormon missionaries seemed to fulfill that anticipation. And the Irvinites were another similar group. In America, there were, they could be called Baptists, like Roger Williams in Rhode Island. And he was anticipating a restoration of authority, either apostles or an endowment of a charismatic endowment of authority. The position of the seekers, I call them all seekers. They're not necessarily seekers with an S. There was an actual seeker sect in England that were anticipating this kind of restoration. These seekers believed that since there was an apostasy from the ancient Christian church, that Catholicism was an apostate organization and they had lost authority, and they wanted or were waiting for a more charismatic, spirit-filled authority of that they believed that no baptism could be performed or communion served without special authority being restored, that it was all dead works. So they were waiting. They wouldn't perform baptism or the Lord's Supper. And it turns out that Lucy Smith's brother, Jason, was a seeker minister who also had a commune in New Brunswick, a commune of about 30 families. And they were seekers waiting for this kind of restoration. And Jason had a strong impact on Joseph Smith Sr. And when you read about Lucy's accounts of Joseph Smith Sr.'s dreams, he was anticipating a more spirit-filled restoration, but he had seen the whole religious world as being spiritually dead and desolate. And so he and Lucy, at one period in their marriage, didn't baptize their children. They didn't baptize Alvin especially, because when Alvin died unbaptized, the minister at the burial implied very strongly that Alvin had gone to hell because he was unbaptized. And that sent the family, the Smith family, into commotion, really, into very distress. It was a very distressful time after Alvin's death. And so I argue that Joseph Smith restored this church that his father anticipated would come, and it fulfilled his dreams in order to get his father to join a church that, or the whole family to join a church that they could all agree on, and one that would not consign Alvin to hell. So that's sort of my interest in the seekers was that, and that Sidney Rigdon's group was sort of moving along those lines out of Campbellism for their own reasons. Their own conclusions were similar to that kind of philosophy. And a lot of the early Campbellites, in converts in Ohio, when they got baptized, they were looking for a sign that they had been baptized by authority. And that was when they came up out of the water, just like the Book of Mormon says, you'll sing the praises of Jesus and speak in a new tongue. And that was evidence that the baptism had been performed by the Spirit. And this was before the angel ordination stories ever occurred in the mid-1830s. Mormons looked for charismatic authority during these early years. They knew nothing about angel ordinations. There were no claims of angel ordinations until the 1830s.
Just a genuinely very interesting period of time. And I just wanted to double check here. So it's Charisma Under Pressure is the tentative title of this book?
Yes.
And when do you anticipate that this book will be released?
They tell me, because their schedule is already full, it won't be until 2023.
Okay, so we have a little ways to go. So get a little preview there, folks, of that period of time. You know, one of the other things, and we're just going to touch on this briefly because you've done a lot of Book of Abraham stuff already. I encourage everybody to watch your recent episode on Mormon Stories where you discuss it very extensively. But during this period of time, we also have the story of the coming forth of the Book of Abraham via Chandler's mummies and the parchments that were found and deciphered. So this is the period of time where not only is the authority structure being put in place, and he's working the church, but he's also now giving us new scripture too. Right, and telling the world that, hey, we've got some new scripture here that made its way into our hands. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Well, the Book of Mormon came first, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, Joseph Smith began dictating a translation from the gold plates, very familiar story.
Mhm.
But did he really get real plates and really translate real plates? Did he believe that he had plates? Or, as I have argued for many years now, that Joseph Smith was felt he wanted to produce what would be called best be described as pseudepigrapha. Pseudepigrapha is writings, pseudo writings, not writings by the author, but somebody pretending to be the author. Say, like in ancient times, pseudepigrapha was known as maybe the Assumption of Moses or the books of Enoch. These kinds of books were not really written by Moses and not written by Enoch. They dated to the Christian era, actually, and or near it or around it. And these were, I mostly take my cue here from Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman has written books on New Testament pseudepigrapha. And he explains it as persons in the early Christian church who wanted to solve religious controversies or introduce doctrines that were not clearly expressed in the New Testament writings or even the Old Testament writings. And they wanted to smuggle them into the Christian church. And they did so by pretending to be ancient prophets or patriarchs that happened to incidentally mention the doctrines they wanted introduced. And that gave those doctrines authority. And these pseudo authors, though, remained anonymous. Joseph Smith, in my view, Joseph Smith is a pseudepigraphist, and he believes he's inspired, though. The ancient pseudepigraphists necessarily didn't believe they were inspired. And they would remain anonymous. They wouldn't be known. Joseph Smith is known. And so my take on it is that Joseph Smith felt inspired, wanted in a general way, as he was dictating the Book of Mormon, not a real specific way. A Doctrine and Covenants section 9 mentions when Albert Cowdery wanted to translate in the first month that they had met, that is April 1829, Albert Cowdery wanted to try his hand at translation too, because he was a rod worker. He worked a divining rod and wanted to try to translate. And Joseph Smith finally allowed him to try, but Albert Cowdery failed. We don't know the details, but Albert Cowdery failed. And then Joseph Smith gets revelations telling Albert Cowdery that he did not understand the process, that he thought God would just give it to him without working it out in his mind. And the instruction was that he should have worked it out in his mind and then prayed and asked God if it was right. And if it was right, God would cause a burning in his bosom to verify or confirm that he had worked it out in his mind correctly. But if he had not worked it out correctly, he would have a stupor of thought and forget the thing that was wrong. And then it says, therefore, you cannot write that which is sacred, save it be given you from God. So this was the process. This was Joseph Smith kind of revealing his process, even though he pretended to put a seer stone into a hat and then put his face in the hat and claimed in the light. In a spiritual light would shine from the stone, and on the stone he would read the translation. My interpretation is that he did it in this way to increase faith among his followers, especially his father. His father was a money digger. His father used a rod. His father used a seer stone. And he believed his son actually could work this seer stone. And so that was authority. That the first authority Joseph Smith had was from this seer stone.
Well, it reminds me, as I recall, in the court case, Joseph Smith Sr. even says that, he has this gift, and I'd rather he use this gift for God's work than for secular means, for monetary gain. It almost sounds like he's working off of that as well.
Yeah, this is in one account of the 1826 trial. This is before Joseph Smith thought of, or had at least translated. He hadn't translated anything. The claim was that he had discovered the plates in the hill in 1823, but he carried on as a treasure digger or a treasure seer. And he got hired by Josiah Stoll from South Bainbridge, about 150 miles from Palmyra. He came all the way to Palmyra and hired Joseph Smith for his ability to see treasures in his stone. Joseph Smith had surpassed other seers that were around his community. This was not a rare thing. Joseph Smith using a seer stone. He wasn't the only one using a seer stone. There was 3, 4, 5 people in his own community of Manchester and Palmyra that used seer stones, including Sally Chase, William Stafford, his own father, and Walters the magician came and used a seer stone to find a treasure in Joseph Smith's backyard practically. And so Joseph Smith, he surpassed them in his ability to instill confidence in his father and other people. And the word of his ability got spread about so far away that even Josiah Stoll came and hired him and took him back, not to South Bainbridge, but to Harmony, Pennsylvania, that it was south of South Bainbridge on the Susquehanna River. And there was a location on the river there in the great bend of the river where they believed that there was a treasure, a Spanish mine that the Spaniards had buried anyway, treasure, silver, coins. And on 3 successive summers, Josiah Stoll had gone there to, or money digging companies, let's say, had gone there searching after this treasure, and they hired a woman by the name of Odell to look for the treasure first, and they kept failing. And then now Josiah Stoll decided to try one more time at least, and hired Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith and his father went down to Harmony, Pennsylvania, and they were there for about a month before Joseph Smith says that he talked the old gentleman out of pursuing it any longer, and they disbanded. But Joseph Smith stuck around. He didn't just go home. His father went home, but he stuck around and lived with Josiah Stoll during the winter and went to school with his sons. And Josiah Stoll hired him to search for other treasures. And finally, some of the family members got upset and thought Joseph Smith was deceiving their, what was a nephew, uncle, a Bridgman, guy named Bridgman. I think it was Peter Bridgman, something like that. It took Joseph Smith to court, and they tried him on a disorderly conduct. Back at that time, it was illegal to pretend, and the law considered all attempts pretending. They didn't distinguish between true seers and fake seers. It was against the law to pretend to see in the earth, to see in the ground, and to do all sorts of other kinds of, what they call fraudulent schemes. And that was put under the disorderly conduct clause in New York law. Of course, it's not there anymore. But So they tried Joseph Smith in March of 1826. And during the trial, it's very, very uncertain exactly what was going on, because the records, we don't have like a perfect documents in this case to know exactly the outcome. It's kind of disputed whether he was found guilty or not found guilty, or an off the cut record agreement was made that Joseph Smith would quit money digging, and so he was let go. Some of the counts state that. But William D. Purple, who lived in nearby Green, near South Bay Bridge in Green, New York, in Chenango County, was at the trial and kept notes. And in 1877, published his account. And his account is the only one to mention that Joseph Smith Sr. Spoke to the court. This was a preliminary hearing, so nobody was under oath, really. And Joseph Smith Sr. said that he would hope that his son would find a better use for his gift than the searching after filthy lucre. And so a lot of people quote that as maybe Joseph Smith took that as his cue, that his days as a money seeker were limited, and he moved on from that to use his gift in a more religious fashion.
One of the most fascinating stories that I watched on one of your videos, I believe, was how you talk about, so we have the seer stone, but we also have the issue of the interpreters, the spectacles. And as from my understanding, there was somebody actually kind of introduced the idea of interpreters into the narrative. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, this was in Palmyra. There were other seers, and Samuel Lawrence was another one of these seers. And he was a little older, and he was a friend of Joseph Smith's. And Joseph Smith had seen the plates in 1823, he said, and then in 1824 he was supposed to return to the hill to get the plates, but he was supposed to bring his brother Alvin, but Alvin died in the interim, and so he couldn't get the plates in 1824, and he stopped. There was no going every year. That story came later. He was supposed to get them in 1824, and he failed because he wasn't able to bring Alvin to the hill with him. That's what he told his family in 1824 when he returned from the hill without the plates. So then the Palmyra revival occurred, and he was participating in that with his family. And he had returned a stone actually to Willard Richards, who is the real owner of the stone. It was found on his property while digging a well, and Joseph Smith and Alvin were helping dig the well. And Joseph Smith borrowed it, he said, because he could see things in it. And then he returned it. And during this period, he went through kind of a religious phase. And then he suddenly asked for the stone back again and wouldn't return it after that, which made Willard Richards angry. But the stone gave Joseph Smith this credibility because there was a well-known family with Sally Chase in it, who was a seeress and used a stone, a bluish green colored stone herself. And they pronounced it as a legitimate stone. So Joseph Smith wanted that stone that had this credibility with it, and he borrowed it, and then he resumed his treasure seeking activities. And he went to the hill again and pointed out the location of the plates to Samuel Lawrence, and asked Samuel Lawrence to verify their existence in the hill so that Joseph Smith would get a second witness to the reality of the plates. And this was apparently in 1824 or 5, or 1825 or 6. So according to Willard Chase, Samuel Lawrence looked in his stone and saw the plates. But he said to Joseph, well, I see the plates, but I also see a giant pair of spectacles. Can you see them? And Joseph looked and said, no. And then Samuel says, well, you better look again. And he looks, and Joseph Smith looks and then sees the spectacles. Well, my interpretation of this episode is that Samuel Lawrence is only adding an element that he can see more than Joseph Smith, that he can see spectacles. These weren't magical spectacles that they turned out to be when Joseph Smith retrieved the plates in the quote Urim and Thummim that he called them later. They were just spectacles, and they were large because the Mound Builders were believed to be a large race. And that's all. They were just spectacles. Well, so Joseph Smith gets his second witness, but Samuel Lawrence, because this is all a confidence scheme anyway, Samuel Lawrence can go away from this and say, well, I saw something Joseph Smith didn't see. My stone's more powerful than his. You know, my gift is greater than his gift. And so his reputation was enhanced, and Joseph Smith regained a reputation for seeing things in the earth with a second witness to the plates. At this point, though, it's not clear what these plates were going to be, or they were just an artifact in the hill, and just the same as when he saw in Miners Hill earlier, around 1823, a golden throne that the king sat on, hidden in this hill that Joseph Smith Sr. dug for quite a while. So these were artifacts that they could see but never obtain. And Joseph Smith could see the plates in the hill in his stone, and he could probably read them with his stone to his family on these evening conversations that Lucy Smith used to talk about. Where did he get this information? Not just from talking to the messenger, once a year, So it's possible. There's no details about how he told these stories and described them in detail as if he lived amongst them, Lucy said. This to me would suggest that it was seeing things in his stone about these plates before that. In fact, the stone was used, according to Martin Harris, to find the plates, the location of the plates, when Joseph Smith went there after he had seen this messenger.
So the most interesting thing to me, I'm sorry, you're going to say something?
Yeah, so the sequel to this is that when Joseph Smith does get the plates and he does take the spectacles, and he shows off the spectacles to his mother, according to her history, under a cloth. She's allowed to feel them, and they're like some kind of metal, and it's bent in a figure 8, and she could feel the stones in the two bows of the figure 8. And after that, he discards them as quickly as possible. He may have had them behind the curtain when he was copying the characters from the plates in harmony later on. But after that, he uses the stone in the hat to translate with.
So even the
He doesn't use the spectacles.
so even for the lost 116 pages, you're saying that he was using the stone in the hat for that as well?
Yes, because Martin Harris was the scribe
Mhm.
for most of the lost 116 page manuscript. And Emma also. They both describe the stone in the hat. They don't describe using the spectacles. Martin Harris describes the spectacles, but he whenever he describes translating, the stone is in the hat. And he even tells that one story of switching the stone, and then he said he found a stone down by the Susquehanna River while they were throwing stones, resting from their long translation periods. And he decided he found a stone he thought looked like the other stone, but of course, no two stones look the same really. But he switched them, and Joseph looked into the hat, and then in the darkness said, "What's wrong, Martin? All is as dark as Egypt. You can't, nothing's happening. You should note that this story implies that the stone has magical properties. It isn't just some kind of focal point and it all happens psychologically. The story implies the stone is integral to the whole process, that it has some kind of special properties like Joseph Smith claimed."
So going back briefly to the Book of Abraham, one of the questions, when I was watching your presentation at Mormon Stories, you had mentioned, I believe, I'm just trying from memory here, that you had quoted Lucy as saying for the process of translating the Book of Abraham that he was employing a hat at that time as well. Now, the question I have for you, was he using the seer stone? Was he just using a hat, or was he also using the seer stone for the Book of Abraham?
Well, there's no firsthand account by Joseph Smith or those the people that were scribes, but this this statement by Lucy in 1845, 46, she said in a public meeting that Joseph Smith would place the stone in the hat to his face, and he could read the parts that were missing on the papyri as well as the parts that were there. Because there's that question, if he's translating and there's parts missing, how can he translate it if there's parts missing? There's also other statements, one by Wilford Woodruff. He calls it a Urim and Thummim, but Urim and Thummim by this time was used interchangeably with the spectacles and the seer stone. And Wilford Woodruff said he used the seer stone. There's a blessing that Cowdery gives Joseph Smith in 1834 that mentions that he would be the seer, with the Urim and Thummim again translating. So there are these clues that perhaps he did use the seer stone again.
And the other clue that I find interesting is when they did that expedition to Massachusetts to find the buried treasure under that house. Is the implication there that he may have been employing the seer stone to look for that as well?
No, he was told
a particular location, yeah.
Yeah, he was told that there was a treasure map and that there was a certain house at a certain basement, and they went there with that in mind.
Okay.
It wasn't like a supernatural.
Okay, so this was more.
It may have been involved after they got there. I don't know, but how they got there was that they were told that there was a treasure in the basement of some man's house that nobody had ever uncovered, and which is a kind of a bizarre story in itself, that they would go that far and stay that long in Salem, Massachusetts, looking for the this stone. I mean, for the treasure.
Yeah, it just seems to call back to an earlier, like a throwback to an earlier era, maybe less
Yeah.
supernatural, but still kind of a callback to his money digging days. One of the things that I find interesting is when I got Bushman's book, Rough Stone Rolling, one of the things that really stuck out to me was when I read about him talking about the Book of Abraham, he described it as apocryphal. It could be best described as being apocryphal. Well, that was a surprising statement to me because the Deseret Books is distributing this book with that statement in there. So, and that's what I found. So that's what really struck me was, wait a second, this is church approved and it's being distributed by them, and it's saying that the Book of Abraham is apocryphal. So I guess I just wanted you to address that, and also maybe we could even talk a little bit about Bushman's work as well.
Well, I'm not sure what he meant by that. Apocryphal, whether he meant it's a pseudepigrapha, like how I view it.
I think if you read the context, I think that's kind of the direction he's leaning towards. Is yours? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There are an increasing amount of LDS scholars that are seeing it as apocryphal or pseudepigraphic. That the papyri acted as a catalyst for Joseph Smith to receive an independent revelation on Abraham and some doctrines that were important to the church at the time. They are not sure whether it was the revelation was a translation of an actual Book of Abraham, that wasn't present, or whether it was just a revelation, pseudepigraphic, like I argue. A modern book, but yet inspired about an ancient, in an allegorical way, to use Abraham as a way of a model of trying to express new yet inspired doctrines, like the high priesthood. Right off in Joseph Smith's dictation of the Book of Abraham, the first part right away deals with Abraham receiving the priesthood through the lineage of his fathers, having the right of the priesthood. Well, the Old Testament has no priesthood lineage in it. A high priest or Melchizedek priest, Melchizedek wasn't around in the days of Adam, of course, but this priesthood comes up from Adam up to Melchizedek and to Abraham, I guess, even though that Book of Abraham doesn't mention Melchizedek. But the concern is for Joseph Smith to get scriptural proof for his high priesthood, introduction of the high priesthood in 1831, as well as the patriarchal priesthood that he was developing and introducing to the church in 1834. And there were some of his own followers questioning whether they should have introduced the high priesthood. They saw, there were some of the men had what they thought were evil manifestations at the time that caused all sorts of contortions in their bodies when they got ordained. And even Hiram Smith tried to stop the process in 1831 of introducing the high priesthood, saying, surely this is not a good sign, that it's an evil sign. And Joseph, give me some sort of evidence. And Joseph talked him into thinking that it was that Satan was trying to stop the introduction of the high priesthood. So that was a concern right off. Different people questioned whether Jesus was our only high priest, like the Book of Hebrews says. But Amos chapter 13 implies that there were a lineage of high priests, Melchizedek being the chief of these high priests. And so Joseph Smith probably used that to convince a lot of the brethren. But the high priesthood was developing in 1834, like I said, into the patriarchal priesthood. And the patriarchal priesthood was supposed to be, according to Josephus, this patriarchal priesthood lineage also included authority to the kingship, to theocracy. And this fit with his attempt to establish Zion in Missouri. And then some of the brethren, including Oliver Cowdery and others, didn't know whether they should try to establish an actual kingship in America. It wasn't, a lot of them were very Republican minded.
Mm-hmm. So is the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, but I mean, they wanted their freedom. They didn't want to be dictated to by an ecclesiastic authority of some kind in their worldly affairs. Mm-hmm. They thought Joseph was going too far in trying to have an actual, treasonable even, an actual government within the United States territory. Although I would, as a footnote, when they first were going to establish the New Jerusalem, it was going to be in the Indian territory and not in the United States territory. So there was a change of plans, and that kind of made it a little more complicated. But at any rate, back to the Book of Abraham. The Book of Abraham was concerned with establishing this patriarchal priesthood, and it was Pharaoh of Egypt who claimed to have authority through the patriarchal lineage, through Ham, to be a pharaoh and establish a patriarchal government, and that he was an illegitimate. The Book of Abraham declares he was an illegitimate heir to this, or claimant to this patriarchal lineage, and that only Abraham was of the correct lineage through his father. So that's one concern. Another concern was pre-existence, that there was a pre-existence. It implied that, it says Abraham was one of these gods that were participated in the creation. And by implication, Joseph Smith was also, so this is one of the roads to the, deification of Joseph Smith in a way. But so there was that. The Joseph Smith worked in his version of creation from what he learned as a student of Hebrew and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. So there's so much convergence going on in this period of time. Book of Abraham, I recommend this book very heartily. And just real quick, just to put a bow on Richard Bushman. So, when your book came out, Joseph Smith, do you have your copy of your biography? Why don't you show that to the audience? So, so there's, hold on, I'm going to switch over to gallery.
The Making of a Prophet.
Yep, The Making of a Prophet. Oh, here, we'll have it side by side for the first time, right?
Joseph Smith, The Making of a Prophet.
Yes. So tell me, what do you think are some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses of this book? You actually, one of the very first YouTube videos you ever gave was maybe comparing and contrasting, talking a little bit about his work. Your books both came out at the same time, and both were important, groundbreaking works in their own right. Maybe just talk a little bit about that.
Mine came out a little bit before his,
mm-hmm.
which I was glad to do, because then I didn't have to really deal with a lot of stuff he wrote. But it was very surprising to me. He was very candid about a lot of issues, which has since got him into trouble with more conservative-minded believers. Yet he pulls back and he admits that he writes as a believer and that he doesn't allow his mind to go into certain areas that would question Joseph Smith. Although I don't question Joseph Smith, as I cannot, as a scholar, say Joseph Smith was not a prophet, or that he was not inspired, or that the Book of Mormon is not inspired. I can say it's not ancient. I can say the Book of Abraham's not ancient, but I cannot say that the book is not, or those books are not inspired. I can say that they reflect Joseph Smith's environment and the things around him and his concerns. That's what historians do. But whether that's inspired or not is not a scholarly question. Now, as close as I could get is to say, did Joseph Smith believe they were inspired? Historians can't answer that. And I answer that in the affirmative, that I believe he believed that he was inspired. He was totally conscious that they were not ancient. He could still believe they were ancient, but he didn't believe they came from gold plates or papyri or whatever. He could still believe that they were inspired, though, and that he was working it out in his mind, that God was giving him confirmation that what he's working out was true. Or, that when he says the most correct book on earth, he's really talking about the most doctrinally accurate, and but Bushman is limited in that fashion. But boy, I was surprised to see that the family dynamics were seen in his book as similar as I had reconstructed them. And that's mostly because he has had training in psychology. He has paid attention to those things. And I learned the family systems theory, family systems approach to try to see the family, rather than seeing one person in it and their psychological problems, let's say, to see the family as a system, that the family seeks a homeostasis, a balance, and different parts are being played to keep it in balance. And I learned that firsthand in my own therapy, but I had also studied it academically in the university and on my own to write about the Smith family dynamics and how it fits into the historical sources, or is supported by the historical sources as I see them. It also helped me see things that I wouldn't have seen in the sources otherwise. So my general impression of Rough Stone Rolling is positive. Some people see it as apologetic still. He's still being an apologist somewhat, and he pulls back. But I don't mind that so much. I'm not, I'm just happy for what he did write. He wrote a whole biography. My biography is only a partial biography, which I'm working on the other phases of Joseph Smith's life as I go on. I don't know what else you want to know about
So,
this.
well, putting a bow on that, that's good. I appreciate to hear what you have to say. And then since we're talking about other biographies, so talking about another interesting book to contrast with is No Man Knows My History, Fawn Brodie. A few things that I found fascinating. One, she brought her a lot of Freudian stuff in here. So she was psychoanalyzing the prophet.
Sort of.
Yeah, sort of brought that in.
The Freudian stuff's overplayed.
Well, it was more so in the Nixon biography where she went full-fledged Freudian.
Okay.
But this was kind of the beginning of her reading that, or writing in that vernacular. But also, one thing I also want to contrast with is the idea of, you come up with the idea of a pious fraud. Now, we talked about this the other day, how Fawn doesn't. When I read her book, I was like, I don't think she understands what it's like to be a believer. she just assumed that he was a scoundrel or just a fraud from the beginning. And you actually kind of go a different direction where you kind of take and you use the term pious fraud. So maybe just compare and contrast your approach and where she was coming from.
Right. So hold on one moment.
Yep. So, hey, this is great. I'm getting all this information, folks, from Dan Vogel, and this is very exciting. I get to ask all these great questions to him that I've had for years, and here he's back.
I just wanted to get my copy.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great.
This is a second edition, though. A second enlarged, revised in a large edition. I got when I was just off my mission, practically.
Wow, that's great.
And I marked it up and I read it. I liked it. Well, I thought at the time I was a believer, and I tried to work through a lot of what she wrote. It's really well written, like from the view of a novelist in a way, because she is an English major. She writes really well. She focuses on that part of what she's writing. Now, a lot of what she's written is a little outdated somewhat, not necessarily inaccurate, but a little outdated and could be more nuanced. Dale Morgan, who was a really good Mormon historian who worked in the Library of Congress, helped her do research and writing and finding her point of view. And I think because this was the first biography really written by a professional, and she probably overemphasized the negative aspects of fraud and didn't quite delve into Joseph Smith's possible sincere religious feelings. So she writes him as essentially irreligious. A lot of people have a hard time fathoming how can a religious person lie in God's name. They can't get that worked out in their minds, so they just assume, oh, it's got to be a fraud. It can't be. There can't be any sincere motivation involved, because how can somebody hold in their own being sincere belief and yet at the same time be committing the worst possible sin of pretending to speak for God, blasphemy and things like that. So there is, my view is kind of opposite, that Joseph Smith was too religious in a way. He was a zealot. He was so religious. A zealot will become so zealot for their cause that they will actually come around and become what they're fighting. So it's like thinking about the terrorists who commit atrocities in the name of God. How can they do that? Well, that is very hard for us to work out in our minds, but it's possible. People do it all the time. It happens. And they rationalize and justify whatever behavior they need to do to accomplish their goal. And my view is that Joseph Smith actually believed he was authorized by God. And there is little hints of this. It's sort of like Nephi, the story of Nephi. He meets up, he's tasked to get the brass plates. He's tasked to get the brass plates from Laban, and he can't get them from Laban. And so he gets kicked out by Laban, and he and his brothers run. And then Nephi gets the idea he's going to sneak in. He's going to try to get the plates, but he runs into Laban, the drunken Laban, and the spirit whispers to him to cut his head off, to kill Laban. And Nephi's repulsed by that idea. And the Spirit whispers to him that it's going to produce the greater good. It's better that one man perish in unbelief than a whole nation perish in unbelief. So it's the greater good. Nephi hesitates and says, I've never broken the commandments. I've always kept the commandments. He can't do this act. And that's when the Spirit tries to convince him that it's going to produce the greater good. And so Nephi crosses that moral line into this other territory and slays Laban and puts on his armor and goes in and gets the brass plates and accomplishes his mission, so that they're able to take the plates back to the New World, and they have the scriptures, which is a greater good.
Kind of an end justifies the means type kind of.
Sort of like that. That's my view. There's other stories I could tell in Joseph Smith's own writings that show that Joseph Smith at least had this kind of thinking. He had the ability to rationalize his behavior. And so I believe Joseph Smith is sincere, and that it's too much faith maybe that pushed him into this area of doing the greater good. He knew he could accomplish this mission. He would convert more souls than he would otherwise. And that was a greater good, including his own father. He can convert his own father, who was unconverted, and where the family was divided. And he brought the family together by being able to convert his father through the authority of his stone, through the ability to use deception for a good cause. And then he projected this out into this same principle out into the world.
So just since we're here, I just have to throw this guy out here, Robert Remini's Joseph Smith biography. This kind of ties in with the time period that you're currently working on, the Jacksonian era. Robert Remini is one of the premier Jacksonian historians. I love him and his work. What do you think about this little volume he put out?
Well, it's a simple, quick introduction. We used Robert Remini's, and I still do, his books in my university course on Jacksonian history. We used that and another book he wrote on the 1828 election or campaign. And I had the pleasure of introducing Robert Remini at Sunstone for one session.
Wow.
And after he published that book, he came to Sunstone to promote it. And I was the guy that introduced him to the audience. And I use his stuff. He is the expert on that period. He wasn't intending on answering all the controversies. He just wanted to produce a general introduction to Joseph Smith to a larger audience that didn't have a lot of time to read.
Yeah, I thought it was a fine book, and I think it's a credit to have one of the premier Jacksonian historians recognize the importance of Joseph Smith, and that he was an important historical figure in the scene at that time as well.
Well, what makes him important is that he had so many followers.
Yes.
And absolutely. That he was able to establish an organization that was self-perpetuating and rewarding, and his followers kept his memory alive. If Joseph Smith had gone into obscurity like some of these other minor prophets, like the leather stocking prophet in northern Ohio that nobody knows about, then yeah, we wouldn't be talking about him, and there wouldn't be as much written on him. And right. So Remini during his presentation did emphasize that that aspect of Joseph Smith, that his genius of creating an institution that was still alive makes the Joseph Smith worth studying.
Absolutely. Yep. So how you doing here? Because I want to talk a little bit about a few more things.
Oh,
Are we doing good? All right, good. I'm having fun. Are you?
yeah, sure. Go.
Good. So one of the things I wanted to mention to you is that, the other day when we were doing an off the record conversation, much of my audience is very interested in the different proposed geographical locations of where the Book of Mormon took place. Now, I have a lot of people who are viewers of mine that are, believe in the heartland model of it taking place in the primarily in the upper Midwest. And of course, I have people, the standard, or the kind of the more traditional or more modern understanding of the Mesoamerica model. But one of the things that you propose is you kind of have your own, if you will, model, and you would say a hemispheric model for the events. In other words, the writer of the Book of Mormon is using a hemispheric model to maybe perhaps inform the story of the Book of Mormon. Would that be kind of where you'd be coming from?
My position is to defend the first readers of the Book of Mormon,
right? Who you think
their view, no matter how unscientific it may seem. We're stuck with the context in which the Book of Mormon was written, and I believe Joseph Smith wrote it, and that he, in common with his contemporaries, had a view of that there was only one Indian, there wasn't different Indians, that there was one origin, one main origin anyway. He allowed for other groups to come across from Jerusalem, like the Mulekites afterwards, or that the Jeraldites came over before them. But the main theory at Joseph Smith's time was the Mound Builder myth. And the Mound Builder myth was hemispheric in geography, and because they saw all the ancient works, the works down in South America and Peru, in Central America and Mexico, and the mounds in the Mississippi Basin as being the works of one race, a white race. All of them were constructed by one race, and that they began in the South. This was the dominant theory. They began in the South with this high civilization with palaces and towers, and great walls and roads, the ability to work in steel and writing, that they had this hieroglyphic type writing, which most people know, the Mayan writing. They knew about all this up in Joseph Smith's region, and that they began down there, and that as time went on, they began to degenerate, and that the Indian destroyed them in the Great Lakes region, the land of many waters in the Book of Mormon, and destroyed them, and that the mounds were mass burial grounds of the dead in the Great War. Some of the mounds were temple mounds, and other mounds were fortification mounds, because not all the mounds were a pile, like a hill shape. Some of them actually have shapes of animals, but like the Serpent Mound in Ohio, or circular with an opening. And that on top of the circular mound were picket works, which the Book of Alma describes in great detail during the time of General Moroni. And so it describes them in great detail. It also describes, these palaces in very vague terms, because they were so remote to Joseph Smith's place. But he describes in great detail the picket works that Moroni constructed to protect his people. So the Mound Builder myth was hemispheric, and I believe the Book of Mormon fits that hemispheric model the easiest, even if it's not historical. But those who want to make it an actual history don't want to talk about that. They want to just focus on small areas, small geographic areas, because in time it became noticeable that the geography of the Book of Mormon, hemispheric geography, was untenable. It couldn't work in the real world. And this happened basically in 1887, when the Reverend Lamb of Utah published a book called The Golden Bible. And in there, he questioned the recent publication by Orson Pratt of the Book of Mormon in 1879, had footnotes with Lehigh Landing in Chile and the Cumorah being in New York. And the dominant theory that took hold over time to get away from that problem, plus rapid population growth, was the limited Tehuantepec theory, where the Mayans are featured. The Mayans, Olmecs, are featured in Central America as being the Jeraldites, and then the Nephites and Lamanites. The Isthmus of Tehuantepec in southern Mexico was supposed to be the narrow neck of land, and that's like 130 miles across, and they imagine that some Nephite, on which the Book of Mormon, in the Book of Alma, names, Alma 22, 32, I believe it is. Just in around that same chapter talks about the line that can be drawn from the east to the west sea, that it took a day and a half journey for a Nephite to travel. Well, John Sorensen imagined it was some sort of Nephite runner that could run from one point to another point in a day and a half. Well, the problem with that theory was that the seas are on the north and the south. And Sorensen suggested that cardinal directions are culturally defined. And he's imagined that it could be tilted. Maybe the Nephites had a geography orientation of 45 degrees, tilted 45 degrees in order to get it the seas on the north and the south.
Yeah. Well, and you had pointed out in the hemispheric model that there's actually a particular spot on the map in which you can actually, it seems to fulfill the particulars of a relatively narrow area of land, and also a east sea, west sea orientation.
Yeah, and this is the way the early Mormons, like Orson Pratt and before Orson Pratt, viewed it, was that even though you have a neck of land, which they imagined to be from Tehuantepec all the way to Panama, that's the neck. But the narrow passage where the line could be drawn just above the land Bountiful, which was the highest point on the land southward, that a line could be a short line could be drawn a distance of a day and a half for a Nephite to travel, can only be drawn on this point on the map and nowhere else. And that would be right where Panama connects onto South America, that instead of going east to west like Central America does, it jets downward all of a sudden into South America. And there's the Pacific Ocean on the west, but on the east, there's a bay or gulf, the Gulf of Darien, as it was called, the Gulf of Darien. And right there where it connects can be drawn a line that touches water on both sides from the east to the west. So, and it's only about 20 miles. And if you're on the hills of Panama, you can see both seas at the same time. But it should be kept in mind that for 100 years, almost, or whatever, how many decades, for decades, Mormons held a hemispheric model, and a lot of Mormons still do, but see no problem with the hemispheric model. Like, how do they travel so fast, across distances, or that the war begins at the narrow neck, and the Lamanites chase the Nephites into the land northward, and they end up in New York.
Yep.
Seems like, an army chasing another army, and they end up at the last battle ground in New York is a little difficult to accomplish in the real world, not in literature, but in the real world. And that nobody sees any problem with this until it's really pointed out to them, like the Reverend Lamb did in 1887, and then started them on this journey of let's find a limited geography. And they've been trying to find a limited geography ever since. And the Heartland model mostly comes out of the Spalding theorists with Vernal Hawley. Vernal Hawley tried to match the Book of Mormon to Solomon Spalding's history. And Solomon Spalding, he was following the Mound Builders in North America, and his histories follow that myth a lot closer than the Book of Mormon does. More accurate. He uses words like the Tennesseans and Kentuckians and things like that. Well, Vernal Hawley tried to match up the Book of Mormon with Spalding's manuscript being just limited to North America. And he started playing around with some of the names of cities and things. And, you get into this very nebulous situation where you can start playing with names. Not a very good sound scholarly method, really. But that's where the Heartland model grows out of. And it's not what the original Mormons believed for many decades, until they were challenged on the distances. And then they tried to turn that argument on its head and say, well, it has to be a limited area. And they started hunting for a limited area, and very forcefully trying to make it, shoehorn it into working. And the problem with Sorensen and tilting the map is that it doesn't matter where they landed. The people usually go by the rising of the sun or setting of the sun, and it sets in the east. And if they came from Israel, it would have set in the east, and they knew where it set in the east, and they would have oriented their cardinal points accordingly. But it would not have been in the direction that Sorensen put it.
Yeah, so I just wanted to maybe have you just share a little bit with my audience. Now, I talked with Jonathan Neville the other day about some of the stuff he had told me, and he disputes some of what you have to say. But I don't really want to make this about a conversation like that. But I do find your hypothesis very interesting. I think it's just, Jonathan talks about multiple working hypotheses. And that's kind of your contribution. For those of you who haven't, Thomas Murphy came on and discussed his view of the Heartland model. And of course, I had Rod Meldrum come on. So all views are being taken into account and heard on this channel. So check those out if you haven't already. So let's see here.
I wanted to add one.
Oh, please do.
One point to this about the early Mormons. I live with the early Mormonism. That's my field. And they believed Lehi landed in Chile, and that Oliver Cowdery in 1830, when he went to Northern Ohio and started preaching, the newspaper reported his preaching included the claim that Lehi had landed in Chile. And there is also a tradition, a very strong tradition. We actually have the words that Lehi landed on the 32nd parallel in Chile. And this was supposed to be a statement by Joseph Smith. And this statement was written down by Frederick G. Williams. Some people try to say, oh, that was a revelation to Frederick G. Williams, but not so. And the tradition handed down with that statement is that it came by revelation to Joseph Smith, which I wrote a long paper, did a Sunstone presentation on, and I hope in the future to put it in a video.
Yes, and just so you know, folks, too, you will be doing a YouTube channel soon, and so when you, or you're going to be putting up new videos, and so when you are going to release your newest video, you're going to come back on. We're going to kind of preview your new series on YouTube. One thing I wanted to, you had mentioned to the audience that how you have written in No Man Knows My History. You had also shown me the Reverend's Golden, the Golden Bible book, where that you bought that first edition and wrote in it. And he said, yeah, you were young and you didn't know what you're doing, and here you have a first edition.
Here's the Golden Bible by Reverend Lamb. It's all beat up, and it was a paperback to begin with, so it's all the signatures are separated. But yeah, this is his book.
Yeah, it's really cool.
I marked it up, but I don't.
Well, you of course, you had mentioned how
I'm not a book collector.
Yes, but you had mentioned, oh, that's oh my goodness, the first 19th century book, and you're marking it up. But I thought, that makes that particular edition very unique, and it's a Vogel edition in your handwriting. So I actually think that makes that even the rarest edition of that book, if you will, and probably worth something. So, well, I really want to tell you, I really enjoyed our conversation that we've had. And you've been so generous with your time, and we've had some technical difficulties, and we both kind of got powered through them, and that was great. I want to get back to this Pastor Cuthbert that you met in England. I want to know a little bit more about him. You had said that he was putting out stuff in England, and materials. Just kind of give me a little insight on what made this guy tick and the kind of stuff he was doing out there.
Well, so Reverend Cuthbert was an Elam Pentecostal.
Oh, Pentecostal Elam. Okay, great. Christopher's going to love to hear that one.
I don't know what Elam means. That's what he told me. Mm-hmm. Elam, and he had a church. And at the time, we drove by the church, and it had like scaffolding. I have a picture of it even. Scaffolding on the one side of it especially, and it had been hit by lightning.
Wow.
So when we knocked on his door, and he had a reputation, his reputation went so far as to get the notice of my friend Brent Metcalf, who was in the London, England mission. And he had heard of Reverend Cuthbert and had seen or listened, I think, also to some tapes of Reverend Cuthbert. And these tapes, I listened to the tapes. I got a hold of one and listened to the tapes. I got some photocopies of some of his literature, and it was actually photocopies of the Tanner's literature with his logo put on it. And it was, a page of the Revelations with all the changes marked on it. So I wanted to meet him because I, wanted some interesting conversation. Put it that way. I wanted an interesting conversation instead of doors being slammed in my face. But so we drove there, and when we knocked on the door and we talked a while, and I said to him, we saw your church. Was hit by lightning, and I kind of said, well, did you claim that it was an act of God on the insurance? That was my joke. So, but he took to me, he liked me, and he invited us in, and he took us into his back garden, and he had like a shed there, and that was his makeshift office. And in it, he had all these books, but he had the Tanner's literature, and he was showing it to me. and pointing this out and that out. And we were discussing things and debating some topics. And during that conversation is when he told me that he had just gotten back from America. He was proud of being an American, but he had gone to Salt Lake and he had met the Tanners, and he wondered why I didn't know of them. He couldn't believe that I didn't know of the Tanners. No, I've never heard of them, or I know absolutely nothing. Even though I had been exposed to anti-Mormonism in California, and especially when I went out tracting with the missionaries, you would meet anti-Mormons and we would debate with them about certain topics. And of course, as I mentioned, I met them in high school, giving me these anti-Mormon arguments. But I had never heard of the Tanners, and they were definitely a step above all this other anti-Mormon, easy stuff that I've heard before, because they got actually into the history of Mormonism and the actual documents and what Joseph Smith and Brigham Young were saying and things like that, not just proof texting from the Bible.
That's right. Yep.
Anybody can slip out of those things. But he had incidentally mentioned, they live by, they're right across the street from the baseball field, and they have a sign that says Modern Microfilm Company on their porch. And I had tucked that away and during our conversation, but I didn't have much contact with Reverend
with Cuthbert,
Reverend Cuthbert after that.
Okay, so it was basically just one conversation you essentially had with him?
There was that, and then somehow, I can't remember, but I had gotten a hold of him years later or afterwards. Maybe he had gotten my address and wrote to me. Maybe he sent me, now I recall of it, he sent me a tape with him talking to me on it.
Oh, interesting.
He had heard over in England about my leaving the church and wanted to just briefly talk to me. I think that was our only one more. It was a tape. I probably have it somewhere here.
Was he aware of the work that you were doing as well, or he had just heard that you had left the church?
I don't think I had published anything yet.
Okay, so he heard you left, and then was he trying to then convert you to Christianity at this point?
I think he did. I think he did. But not strongly.
Right.
But I think he did.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, he was just doing what evangelicals do, right? So, just so you folks know, Elam is it's a Pentecostal denomination. It's primarily based in Great Britain. It's relatively small, but pretty influential there. And I do believe there's a handful of congregations here in the United States as well. Kind of an interesting group. There were some Pentecostal revivals that were happening in the early 20th century that kind of corresponded with what was happening in Azusa Street in Southern California as well. So interesting history if you all want to look into that. It's an interesting church. So Dan, I guess we covered a lot of territory. I've mentioned before that, I've been reading you for decades, watching your videos. You're just one of the most influential people in my journey of my little own personal study of this history. I guess I just want to ask, do you have any, perhaps any final words that you would like to share with my audience?
I don't know along what lines.
Oh, just as well, I guess, okay, let's say put us in this kind of, I don't mean to put you on the spot. I guess if you're to say to somebody who's interested in studying the history of Mormonism, and let's say they don't know a whole lot about it, perhaps you could give them some guidance on what materials and resources they would use, and of course yours, and maybe you could recommend a few good starting points for them, and then just how to, maybe best way to kind of fully engage Mormon history as somebody who maybe doesn't really know a whole lot about it.
Yeah, well, of course, I'm all about studying Mormon history. I'll encourage anybody to study Mormon history from whatever point of view they want to study it. I don't have any I don't segregate people from my study. I talk to anybody that's interested in Mormon history, believers, non-believers. I don't try to deconvert anybody myself. I'm not a deconverter. I'm not really interested in that. I'm just interested in Mormon history. And I want to get and promote it no matter what people study. I mean, there's so many non-controversial subjects to study in Mormon history as well, and I'm all for studying those non-controversial. Not everything has to be, studying Joseph Smith either, but I would say that if my materials are probably going to be serious kind of studies, deep dives into subjects, the nitty gritty, kind of what some people call forensic analysis of sources and things. I'm into the sources. I love the sources. I just love getting into the library and holding those documents and looking at them and things like that. But if anybody wants to know about the problems or they have doubts and they want to know if there's problems, and I would recommend Jeremy Reynolds, the CES letter kind of thing. That's more of a polemical thing that I don't really get into, but it's a quick way to introduce yourself to some problem areas if you feel that you're seeing those kinds of things and you really want to confirm or validate those kinds of feelings. But if you're not, I would, if you read Bushman, that makes me happy too.
Yeah,
I don't know what else to say.
Yeah.
I wish everybody a happy journey wherever it leads you. We're all on a journey, and I have my personal conclusions, but I try to be as scholarly and neutral with the sources, as honest with the sources as I possibly can.
Well, I want to thank you so much. Just even just throw something like this, and like if you want an introduction to Joseph Smith, Remini's book's a good place to go.
Yeah.
I'd say stay away from the anti-Mormon stuff. Personally, as an evangelical, I think a lot of it's, well, I try to stay in. Let's try to stay within the scholarly community, and there's a lot of garbage that evangelicals put out. Now, of course, the Tanners, the materials they put out, they would be a good introduction too. But again, they get really deep into the weeds as well. So if you just want a basic introduction, this is a good place to start. And then just start your journey there. And then just take whatever leads to you. It was the Arnold Freiberg paintings for me as a 7 or 8 year old boy that kind of got me involved in this journey. So, but it's a fascinating story. The story of Mormonism is the story of America. It has so much going for it, and it's so fascinating. I just tell people it's an interesting story just in and of itself. For its own sake, it's worth studying. So I want to thank you, Dan, for coming on my program.
You're welcome. Anytime.
Yeah, we're going to have you back, man. And I just want to remind my audience to like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the notification button to be informed when there will be a new episode. Everybody, we're going to be in 2022 soon. You'll probably see it when it's 2022. Hopefully, we're all here, and you had a happy new year, and God bless.